She sold sweets on the street to survive, facing the sun, exhaustion, and the weight of a life that never gave her rest, until an improbable encounter threw everything off the course she knew. What seemed to be just the purchase of some cocadas by a powerful man soon transformed into an unexpected proposal, capable of stirring old wounds, forgotten memories, and dreams she no longer allowed herself to have. Between difficulties, prejudice, gratitude, and feelings born where no one imagined, this story shows how a simple gesture can open the door to a change impossible to predict. But when the heart begins to believe in something greater, envy, lies, and painful trials also arise that can destroy everything, even before happiness has a chance to bloom. Before getting to know this emotional story until the end, subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the next reports that touch the soul. The sun of Salvador fell heavy over Pelourinho on that early October afternoon, in that inclement way that asks no permission and accepts no negotiation. The colonial stones held the heat like embers, and the wind coming from the sea arrived too warm to serve as relief. Nayara Santana knew that heat by heart. She knew the smell of hot asphalt, the noise of crossing conversations, the weight of the styrofoam box she carried every day to the same corner as always, on the corner of Rua das Laranjeiras, with the slope that went down to Praça da Sé. She was 32 years old and had a posture that did not match the situation. There was something in the way she planted herself on the ground, her feet firm inside her already worn sandals, her chin slightly raised, that made it seem like she was in exactly the right place. Not for lack of option, but by choice. Those passing quickly might not even notice. But those who stopped to buy a cocada left with the strange sensation of having been received by someone who knew very well the value of what she delivered. The cocadas were from an old recipe. Grated coconut sweet with sugar burned on stone, finished with cloves and a pinch of cinnamon that her grandmother said was the secret no neighbor could copy. Nayara had learned to make them as a teenager, standing beside Donna Generosa, observing every movement like someone memorizing a musical score. After her grandmother passed away, she took with her much more than the recipe. She took the family's anchor. What remained for Nayara was the trade, the memory in her hands, and a responsibility that no one asked her to carry, but that she carried anyway. Marcos was 40 years old. He was the foster brother whom her grandmother had taken in when he was still young, after his mother had to be hospitalized for a serious health problem and never returned to the same level of autonomy. He had grown up inside that house as if he were Donna Generosa's son, and Nayara treated him like a brother because that was exactly what he was, by heart, by routine, by history. 3 years ago, Marcos had suffered a serious neurological complication that left him with permanent reduced mobility, dependent on a wheelchair and assistance for part of his daily activities. Nayara had reorganized her entire life around this without making a fuss. She sold what she had of value, looked for a ground-floor apartment in a house in Ribeira, adjusted the budget to what the cocadas earned, and moved forward. The days were long. She woke up early to prepare the sweet, packed everything in transparent sealed bags, arranged the box, left coffee and lunch set aside for Marcos, who had enough autonomy to manage at home with the adjustments they had made to the furniture and heights, and then she left. She took 2 buses. She arrived at Pelourinho before 10 in the morning. She stayed until the box was empty or until her body asked for a stop, which usually happened at the same time. On that October day, the box was still half full when the car stopped. It was a dark vehicle, discreet in color but impossible to ignore in texture, the kind that makes no noise when braking and seems to glide over the asphalt instead of rolling over it. The window rolled down slowly. Inside, a man of approximately 50 years, grey suit without a tie, sunglasses that he took off calmly before speaking. He didn't ask for one cocada. He asked for all of them. Nayara looked at him as if she were hearing another language. Then she looked at the box, did a quick calculation in her head, and said the total price without a tremor in her voice. The man paid in cash, double the amount, and returned the change she tried to give. Before telling the driver to pull away, he lowered the window another few inches and held out a white card with discreet black letters. "Call me tomorrow," he said. "I have a proposal that is worth hearing." The car disappeared down the slope, and Nayara stood there with the card between her fingers, the empty box by her side, and her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She read the name printed on the card once, twice. Rodrigo Cavalcante. Below, a phone number and the name of a company she didn't know. Distrust arrived quickly, as it always did when something seemed too good. Life had taught her to calibrate this instinct with care. Beautiful promises arrived wrapped in flashy papers and almost always hid a bill that needed to be paid later. She tucked the card inside her pants pocket, picked up the empty box and started the way back to the bus stop. During the entire journey, the card burned in her pocket like embers. That night, while serving dinner for herself and Marcos, she placed the card on the table without saying anything. He saw it, read it, raised his eyes to her with that calm and attentive expression that had the gift of emptying any tension from the room. Cavalcante incorporações, he said slowly, like someone recognizing a word in another language. This is Rodrigo Cavalcante. I've heard that name before. Everyone has heard it, Nayara replied, sitting down. That doesn't mean anything. It means he isn't a roadside scammer, Marcos said with a hint of a smile. It also doesn't mean I should go around accepting proposals from strangers who stop their car and buy my whole box without blinking. It means you need to call tomorrow morning and find out what he wants. Nayara looked at her brother for a long second. He had this way of saying the obvious, as if it were ancestral wisdom, and the worst part was that it worked. She sighed, served the rice, and didn't touch the subject again until bedtime. But she slept little. She kept looking at the bedroom ceiling and thinking about overdue bills, about debts that waited at the end of the month like chalk-marked charges, about Marcos needing a new adjustment to the chair that the technician had recommended weeks ago. She thought about her grandmother, how Donna Generosa never hesitated before an opening door, even when there was enough reason to be suspicious. In the morning, before starting to prepare the suite, Nayara took the card and dialed the number. They answered on the second ring. The man's voice was the same, direct, without affectation, like someone who didn't need to impress anyone. I knew you would call early today, he said. Don't make this more dramatic than it needs to be, she replied. What do you want, sir? There was a short, almost imperceptible pause, and then he said, I want to tell you a story, and then I want to make you a proposal that will change both our lives. Nayara pressed the phone against her ear. Outside, the sun of Salvador began to rise again, just like every day. But something about that morning had a different texture, as if the air were charged with a possibility she didn't yet know how to name. Rodrigo Cavalcante's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Avenida Tancredo Neves, in that part of Salvador where commerce and financial power mixed in glass, concrete, and air conditioning. Nayara walked from the bus stop to the building's entrance, with her synthetic leather bag on her shoulder and the address written on a folded paper inside her pocket. She hadn't dressed differently than usual. She wore a beige linen blouse, dark pants, and the new sandals she had bought 2 months earlier at a sale downtown. It wasn't what one expected to find in that lobby of dark marble and indirect lighting, and she knew it. But she entered anyway, with her chin held high. The receptionist looked at her with that cold politeness that is worse than rudeness because it leaves no room for a response. She asked for the name, consulted the screen, confirmed with a slightly raised eyebrow that yes, there was a scheduled time for her, and indicated the waiting armchairs with a gesture that said everything without saying anything. Nayara sat down, crossed her hands in her lap, and watched the movement of the lobby with the same attention she used to read the flow of tourists in Pelourinho, calculating the day. She waited 15 minutes. Rodrigo Cavalcante appeared in the hallway without ceremony, in a white shirt, without a jacket, with the same direct air from the phone call, and the car stopped on the slope. He greeted her with a firm handshake, without exaggeration, and led her to a meeting room smaller than Nayara imagined. Not the main room with a panoramic view, but a more intimate environment, with a round table, 4 chairs, and a window to the building's internal corridor, as if he knew that conversation was not meant to be held in an imposing setting. "Thank you for coming," he said, sitting in front of her. "You paid double for what you bought yesterday," she replied. "It would be rude not to show up." He smiled with one corner of his mouth. It was the first real smile she saw on him. "I'll get straight to the point," he said. The flavor of your cocada took me back to a moment in my life that I spent decades trying to understand. When I was a child, my mother and I were going through a very difficult situation. She worked all day, and even then the money didn't add up. There was a woman in the neighborhood, we lived in a housing complex in Kabula, who appeared every now and then without warning. She left food at the door, left sweets, never asked for anything in return, and never stayed to receive thanks. She was a simple elderly woman who made cocadas. My mother never knew her name. Neither did I. But I never forgot the flavor. Nayara stayed very quiet. A few months ago, he continued, I hired someone to do a search. I wanted to understand where that recipe came from, if there was still someone who made it. The research took time, but it led to an address in Ribera and to the name of a woman named Generosa Santana, who passed away 4 years ago. And then it led to you. The silence in the room lasted a few seconds that seemed much longer than they were. Nayara felt her throat tighten, in a way she didn't want to show on her face, so she breathed slowly through her nose and kept her expression steady. My grandmother, she said. Your grandmother, he confirmed, with a sobriety that was not staged. She never told me that, Nayara said almost to herself. That she helped someone in Kabula. But it also wasn't the kind of thing she would tell. She didn't do things to be remembered. I know, he said. And exactly because of that, I wanted to find you. Not to pay a debt. A debt to that kind of person is not paid with money, but to do something that would make sense for both of us. Then he presented the proposal. The idea was to open a confectionery in Salvador, not a generic confectionery, but a space built around traditional Bahian recipes, focusing on heritage recipes, those that older women carried in their memory, and that were disappearing for lack of record and continuity. Rodrigo wanted Nayara to be a real partner, not an employee, not a consultant, not the face of a campaign, a partner with real participation in profits, a voice in decisions, and her name on the door. Why me? She asked. It wasn't false modesty, it was the right question. Because you know the recipe from the inside out, he replied. Because you spent years selling on the street and understand what people look for when they buy real sweets. And because, he paused briefly, your grandmother's story and my story are connected in a way that doesn't happen by chance. I don't know what else to call this but gratitude that turned into a project. Nayara looked at him for a moment. There was a part of her that wanted to get up, thank him politely, and leave, because accepting something like that was a huge risk. Signing a contract with a man she didn't know, entering a world that had never been hers, giving up the little control she had over her own routine, all of that was terrifying in a way that pride didn't easily allow her to admit. But there was another part, deeper and more honest, that thought of Marcos needing the adjustment to his chair, the bills at the end of the month, the styrofoam box, and the October sun on the stones of Pelourinho. I need to see the contract, she said. Of course, he replied without blinking, and I need to understand everything that is written, not just the summary. You will have all the documentation and can take it to a lawyer you trust to review before signing anything. Nayara nodded slowly. Before getting up, she looked at him one last time with that direct evaluation he had already noticed on the slope, when she had counted the change without hesitation. Do you understand, sir, that if I enter this project, I enter as a partner, not as staged gratitude? I understand, he said, and that is exactly how I want it. She left the building with the folder of documents under her arm and the sun hitting her face. She didn't know yet if she would accept, but she knew that conversation had changed something inside her, in a place that had been closed for a long time, and that her grandmother, if she were there, would have said that a door that opens like this with the smell of cocada and history is not refused without first looking well inside. Marcos heard everything sitting at the kitchen table, his hands around a glass of juice without interrupting once. When Nayara finished telling the story, he was quiet for a time she already knew how to measure. It wasn't hesitation, it was processing. He had this way of letting information settle before speaking, like someone waiting for the dust to settle to see what remained on the ground. And the documents? He asked. I got a referral from Adriana from the sewing job. She has a cousin who is a lawyer. She went through a similar situation with a contract and said this woman is good and charges a fair price. Have you already made an appointment? I scheduled it for Thursday. He nodded. Then he looked at her with that expression that mixed affection and clarity without needing words. Nayara, do you want to do this? The question was too simple for the answer she carried. She stood up, leaning against the sink, and looked at the window that faced the side corridor of the house. Outside there was a pot of basil that she tried to keep alive with some irregular success. I do, she said finally. I'm afraid, but I want to. Then that's it. It's not that simple, Marcos. It never is. But you asked me if you want to, and the answer was yes. The rest is detail that gets resolved. She smiled despite herself. It was exactly this way that made his presence irreplaceable, that ability to reduce the complicated to the essential, not out of naivety, but out of a clarity he had cultivated during years of a life that demanded constant adaptation. On Thursday, the lawyer reviewed the contract line by line with Nayara. It was a serious document, with real participation percentages, protection clauses for both parties, and a structure that gave Nayara voting power in strategic decisions. There was nothing disguised. There was no fine print hiding a trap. The lawyer said that, considering what was being offered, it would be a mistake not to sign. Nayara signed the following week. The first days within the project were a sudden immersion into a world she only knew from afar. Rodrigo's team was composed of people accustomed to a fast pace, with their own vocabulary and a poise in formal environments that made the simple seem complicated. Nayara learned fast, she always had, but there were moments when she entered a room and felt the air change temperature in a way that wasn't the air conditioning. Silvana Braga was the operations director of Rodrigo's company. A 48-year-old woman, hair always impeccable, clothes always appropriate, smile always present, and eyes that calculated with a precision that her mouth never betrayed. She had been hired 5 years earlier and had built a position of solid influence within the company structure. When the news of the partnership with Nayara reached the office, Silvana was the first to reach her with a bouquet of kind words and a warm handshake. But there was something in the way Silvana looked away when Nayara spoke in meetings. Something in the way she reformulated Nayara's ideas with other words, returning them to the group as if they were her own contributions. Something in the way she laughed in a way that didn't close her eyes, as if the laughter were a piece of the costume and not a real reaction. Nayara noticed. She didn't say anything yet. The space chosen for the confectionery was a renovated mansion in the Bonfim neighborhood, a few meters from the church, on a cobblestone street with old trees and constant pedestrian traffic. The place had high ceilings, wide windows, Portuguese tiles on the back wall, and a backyard that would be transformed into an outdoor area with tables. It was exactly the kind of space that matched what Nayara imagined, although she hadn't yet imagined anything formally. The idea had formed inside her upon seeing the place for the first time, like a recognition. Rodrigo took her personally for the first visit to the property. They walked through the rooms without haste, and he let her talk, take notes, open windows, measure with her eyes. There was a naturalness in it that Nayara observed carefully. It wasn't the businessman leading the consultant. It was someone genuinely interested in what she saw. Here could be the production counter, she said, standing in the center of what would be the kitchen, but it would need an adjustable height so that people of different sizes can work without hurting their backs. We can do that, he said without hesitating. And the entrance, it needs a ramp, not that ramp that sits in a corner as if it were a favor, a ramp that is part of the project, at the main entrance. He noted it on his phone. Then he looked at her. You already thought about this before entering here. I think about this everywhere I go, she replied, with a naturalness that wasn't an accusation, it was a fact. When you live with someone who uses a wheelchair, you start to see the world differently. You see where it welcomes people and where it only tolerates their presence. Rodrigo was silent for a moment. Then he said, Did your grandmother also think like that? Nayara smiled. She said that a house that doesn't fit everyone isn't a house, it's a club, and she didn't like clubs. He smiled back, and this time the smile reached his eyes. It was a small thing, but Nayara recorded it unintentionally. The following week, when the renovation began and Nayara started attending the space regularly, Silvana Braga went to Bonfim for the first time. She arrived with an assistant, a clipboard, and a series of suggestions that redirected the concept of the space to something more sophisticated, more aimed at a high-income public with a lean menu and minimalist environment. "The original proposal has a rustic charm," Silvana said in a tone that made rustic a polite word for something else. "But we need to think about scale, about the potential for expansion, about branding that speaks to the contemporary consumer." Nayara heard everything. Then she said calmly, "The original proposal is the proposal. What we are building here is not a branding concept. It is a confectionery with roots. If you remove the roots, only the packaging remains." There was a tense silence. Silvana's assistant lowered her eyes to the clipboard. Silvana kept the smile in place, but her eyes were something else. "Of course," she said, just thinking out loud. When Silvana left, Nayara stood in the middle of the room under renovation, smelling the paint and lime, hearing the noise of tools in the back. She knew, with the quiet clarity of someone who has already learned to read the environment, that that woman was not just thinking out loud. She was testing the ground, and she had understood that the ground did not yield. The problem was that ground that does not yield is sometimes bypassed. The following weeks were the most intense Nayara had lived in a long time, and she had lived weeks intense enough to have benchmarks for comparison. The renovation progressed at the pace of Bahian construction, with its unforeseen events and its pauses, but it progressed. Nayara spent her mornings between Bonfim and a rented space in a bakery in the Federação neighborhood, where she had negotiated the use of the industrial kitchen in the early hours of the day to develop and test the recipes that would make up the menu. She had started with the basics: white cocada, burned cocada, peanut cocada, and passion fruit cocada, all based on the notes she had kept in a notebook of Dona Generosa's, small and irregular handwriting, blue ink faded by time. But there were other recipes besides the cocadas: tapioca cake with coconut, dense and aromatic quindim, green papaya, sweet with cloves, milk pudding with dark syrup that her grandmother called the happy ending of any meal. Nayara tested each one, adjusting proportions, taking notes, repeating. Rodrigo appeared at the production space without warning, sometimes early in the morning, before meetings, with 2 coffees in hand. He never entered by interrupting. He sat on a wooden bench leaning against the wall and watched without asking unnecessary questions. When she asked for an opinion, he gave it honestly. When she didn't ask, he stayed quiet. It was on one of those days, while she was adjusting the consistency of the quindim, and he was drinking coffee in silence, that Marcos arrived by surprise. There was a practical reason. Nayara had forgotten her cell phone at home, and he had requested a ride to bring it. But when he entered the kitchen with the phone held out in his hand, and quick eyes sweeping the room with natural curiosity, it was impossible not to notice that the arrival had a greater weight than the forgotten device. "This must be Marcos," Rodrigo said, standing up from the bench. "This is me," Marcos confirmed, with the same kind of direct smile that Nayara used when she wanted to say a lot without saying anything. The two greeted each other. Rodrigo pulled up a chair so Marcos would be more comfortable beside the counter, and instead of resuming the executive posture, returned to the wooden bench, as if the hierarchy of the environment were determined by the height of the seat and not by the weight of the surname. Nayara observed this movement out of the corner of her eye without stopping what she was doing. Marcos stayed for an hour. In that time he asked questions that seemed simple and were not. He asked Rodrigo how he had arrived at the partnership format instead of hiring, and the answer took longer than a simple answer would. He asked what he expected the confectionery to represent besides profit, and Rodrigo was silent for a moment, before answering that he didn't quite know yet, but that there was something there that needed to exist, as if he were describing a debt that was not financial, and for which there was still no name. "You speak of my grandmother as if she were a figure," Nayara said, without turning from the counter. "She was," he replied. "She was a simple person who made cocada and thought no neighbor should go to sleep hungry if she could do something. Sometimes the simplest people are the ones who carry the world." Marcos looked at the businessman with attention. Then he looked at his sister. There was something in that look that Nayara preferred not to examine closely. The following week, Silvana Braga began to do something that Nayara took a few days to identify precisely. In the company hallways, in casual hallway conversations with other employees, Silvana introduced light and well-packaged comments that had the effect of positioning Nayara's partnership as a gesture of corporate philanthropy. "A very beautiful social initiative," she would say. Rodrigo always had this humanitarian side, and then before the listener could think much, she would change the subject. The result was subtle but consistent. In the minds of those people, Nayara was being installed not as a businesswoman, but as a beneficiary, not as a partner, but as a project. Nayara knew because one of the administrative assistants, a woman named Patricia, who had shown genuine sympathy since the first day, called her discreetly to a hallway and told her what she was hearing. Not as gossip, but as a warning. "I think you need to know," Patricia said with the care of someone who understands the weight of what she is delivering. Nayara thanked her. She showed no reaction other than a firm nod. That night, she arrived home, quieter than usual. Marcos noticed even before she took the bag off her shoulder. "What is it?" he asked. She told him. He listened with a glass of water held in his hand. "She is afraid," he said, when Nayara finished. "Afraid of what?" "I'm not a threat to her position." "It's not the position. It's the space. You arrived and filled a space that she probably thought was hers. Not the position, but the proximity to him. His attention." She realized that he listens to you in a different way, and that bothers her much more than any professional dispute. Nayara stayed quiet. "Are you saying she has an interest in him?" "I'm saying she is used to being the most important person in the room when he is there, and now she isn't anymore." Marcos took a sip of water. "That is much more dangerous than position ambition." Nayara thought about this while washing the dishes, while hanging the laundry, while turning off the bedroom light. She thought about Patricia's warning, the way Silvana smiled without ever closing her eyes, the suggestions that always arrived wrapped in reasonableness and hid a redirection. She had survived things much larger than an office woman with a hallway strategy, but she had learned that underestimating the opponent was a luxury that people without a safety net could not afford. The next morning, she arrived earlier than usual at the company. She sat with Rodrigo before any meeting, and without beating around the bush, told him what was happening. She didn't ask for action. She didn't dramatize. She presented it as information. He listened to her without interrupting. When she finished, there was a tension in his jaw that wasn't there when she started. "I will resolve this," he said. "You don't need to resolve it for me," she replied. "I just needed you to know." He looked at her for a second longer than necessary for a response. "I know," he said, "but I'm going to resolve it anyway." Nayara got up to leave. At the door of the room, he called her name. She turned. "Thank you for trusting me." She didn't answer, but as she walked down the hall toward the elevator, she realized there was something different in the way those 4 words had reached her. It wasn't the gratitude of the investor to the partner. It was the gratitude of one person to another, simple and without wrapping, and that, for some reason she preferred not to examine at that moment, stayed with her all day. The renovation of the Bonfim mansion was in the final stretch when Rodrigo invited Marcos to see the space. The invitation came through Nayara, but with a specificity she found curious. He had asked Marcos to bring anything he wanted to show. The phrase hung in the air without further explanation, and Marcos spent 2 days choosing what to take, before deciding on a folder with some drawings he made in his free time, imaginary floor plans, invented spaces, projects of environments he drew for the pleasure of thinking about how the world could be built in another way. Marcos had studied architecture for 2 years before having to interrupt the course for financial reasons. The interruption had arrived before the health problem that changed his mobility, but even after that, the drawing notebook remained full. He had never shown it to anyone outside the family. Nayara knew of the folder's existence, but had never asked much. It was her brother's private territory, and she respected private territories. On the day of the visit to the mansion, Rodrigo was waiting for them at the door with the architect responsible for the renovation, a man named Fabio, kind and attentive. They walked through the space together, and Rodrigo explained every project decision, while Marcos observed with that specific concentration of someone reading a familiar language. At one point, standing at the main entrance, Marcos turned his wheelchair slowly, measuring the turning radius, and said naturally that the ramp was well executed, but that the unevenness in the transition floor between the sidewalk and the ramp could cause instability in chairs with smaller wheels. Fabio noted it immediately. Rodrigo looked at Marcos with attention. "Do you have training in architecture?" he asked. "Incomplete," Marcos replied. "But the drawings haven't stopped." "Show me." Marcos opened the folder right there, resting on his lap. Rodrigo settled in front of him on one of the workers' plastic chairs and examined each page with a slowness that was not protocol. He asked questions. Marcos answered. Fabio approached, then stood watching with the expression of someone recognizing something he didn't expect to find. These projects take accessibility into account in a way that most professional projects don't, Fabio said. Not as an adaptation, as architecture, because it's not the same thing, Marcos said. Adapting is different from designing. Adapting says the space was made for one type of person and then was adjusted to tolerate others. Designing from the start with accessibility says that every type of person was considered from the beginning. Rodrigo was silent for a moment. Then he closed the folder carefully, returned it to Marcos, and said he wanted to talk about that at another time, calmly, because there was an idea taking shape in his head that still needed space to organize. Nayara watched that scene from afar, leaning against the window that faced the backyard under construction. There was something extraordinarily natural in it, the two men talking about space and design as if they had known each other for a long time, as if the social distance between their stories didn't exist or didn't matter as much as the subject between them. And there was something in it that moved her in a way she wasn't prepared to feel. That same week, the atmosphere at the company soured in a more visible way. Silvana had been informed by Rodrigo in a closed meeting that the narrative about the partnership needed to be corrected internally. He hadn't given Nayara details about what he had said, but the effect was immediate and in the opposite direction of what was expected. Silvana did not back down. She changed strategy. The hallway comments stopped. In their place, administrative gestures arrived, documents that took longer than necessary to be processed, suppliers who received conflicting information about the order specifications, a delay in the transfer of a budget advance that had been approved weeks before, and that was necessary for the payment of the tiles for the second room of the confectionery. Nayara noticed the pattern when the master builder called on Thursday, saying that the material had not arrived and that the supplier had informed that the order was suspended for lack of financial confirmation. She called the financial department and was informed, with all bureaucratic cordiality, that there was a pending signature that needed to be resolved before the transfer. The pending signature was Silvana's. Nayara went personally to the office. She didn't go with anger. She went with a folder with printed documents with dates marked in orange and an expression that wasn't aggressive, but that also left no room for interpretation. She reached Silvana's desk, placed the papers in front of her, and said, with all the calm she had cultivated in years of hot sun and a styrofoam box on her shoulder, "These documents have been waiting for 12 days. The deadline was 5. Tell me what is preventing it." Silvana raised her eyes from the papers and smiled with that clinical precision. "Nayara, there are administrative issues that have their own processes. You are still learning how things work in here, which is completely understandable. No one expects someone without corporate experience to understand the complexity of—" "Silvana," Nayara interrupted her with the same calm tone. "I am a partner in this project. I know the deadlines, the values, and the processes because I read every line of the contract and of every document that passed through my hand. I am not asking for an explanation of how the corporate world works. I am asking for your signature on the document that has been in front of you for 12 days and that you have a contractual obligation to process in 5. Silvana's smile didn't disappear, but something in her eyes changed. She signed. That same day. Nayara left the office with the processed documents and went straight to the bathroom, where she stayed for 2 minutes leaning against the sink, looking at her own reflection. She wasn't shaking, she was whole, but she needed 2 minutes to feel it without witnesses. When she left the bathroom, Rodrigo was in the hallway. He saw her coming out of Silvana's room and deduced something by the posture she carried. "Did you get it?" he asked. "I got it," she replied. He looked at her for a second. "You didn't need to do that alone." "I know," she said, "but it was important that I did." He understood. He didn't try to explain why he understood, and she didn't ask him to explain. It was the kind of thing that is understood or not understood, and between them, understanding arrived without needing words to justify it. That, Nayara realized, as she walked down the hall toward the elevator, was something she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe never. And she didn't quite know what to do with it. The message arrived on a Sunday morning, when Nayara was in the kitchen at home preparing the first batch of quindins of the week. The cell phone vibrated on the counter with a notification from an unknown number. She wiped her hands on the dish towel and read. It was a photo. The image showed Rodrigo on a balcony she didn't recognize, next to Silvana, the two of them too close to be a casual posture. The photo had a light that suggested late afternoon, maybe a weekend. Below the image, without sender identification, a line of text. "You are being used. The confectionery is an excuse to keep you away from the company, while the two of them resolve what's between them. Ask him where he was on Saturday night." Nayara stood looking at the screen for a long moment. The smell of burning sugar on the stove arrived before she realized she had forgotten the pot, and she turned off the stove in a hurry, saving the syrup by a hair. She stood there with the wooden spoon in one hand and the phone in the other, and felt something she didn't quite know how to name. It wasn't anger, not yet. It was more like that feeling when the floor suddenly seems less solid than it should be. Marcos was in the living room drawing. She entered, sat in the armchair in front of him, and handed him the phone without saying anything. He read it, looked at the photo, read the text once more, and returned the device. "What are you feeling?" he asked. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Do you believe this?" She took some time to answer. She sat looking at her hands, still with a trace of egg yolk on her fingers. "The photo exists," she said. "A photo is a snippet," he replied. "You know that better than anyone. But I also know that blindly trusting someone I've known for a few months because of a beautiful speech would be naivety. It's not naivety to trust someone when that person's behavior has been consistent. Naivety is not asking when you have a doubt." She became even quieter. Then she said, almost to herself, "But if I ask, I need to admit that I care about the answer in a way that goes beyond business." Marcos said nothing. He didn't need to. He was the kind of person who understood when silence was the only response that didn't diminish what the other was feeling. Nayara spent the whole Sunday working, producing more than she needed, her body occupied, while her head tried to organize something that resisted organization. On Monday, she arrived at the company earlier than usual and waited for Rodrigo in the hallway before any meeting. When he appeared, she showed the message without preamble. He looked at the photo. His face closed in a way she hadn't seen before, not guilt, but something between indignation and exhaustion, like someone recognizing a blow they already expected to come from another side. "This photo was taken at a birthday dinner for a company partner 6 weeks ago," he said. "There were 40 people. Silvana was there. I was there. The entire board was there. I can send you the full album of the event if you want." "You don't need to," she said. He looked at her. "Did you believe this?" "I needed to ask." "That is different from believing." "Yes," she said. "It is different." There was a pause that lasted less than it seemed. "Nayara," he said, "I understand that you have every reason to be suspicious. Your life taught you that, and it wasn't an unfair lesson. But I need you to know that what I am doing here, what I am building with you, has nothing disguised about it. If it did, you would have found it by now." "I know," she said. "That's why I asked instead of leaving." He nodded, something in his jaw relaxed. That same day, the company's financial sector detected an inconsistency in the transfers destined for the confectionery project. A quick internal audit revealed that 2 transfers had been redirected to a service provider account that did not exist in the original contract. A fictitious supplier registered in the system with superficially valid documentation, but which did not withstand careful verification. The trail led to Silvana. Rodrigo called Silvana for a closed meeting with the legal department that afternoon. Nayara was not present, but she knew from the description of Patricia, who had stayed outside. Silvana had entered the room with the usual smile and left 40 minutes later without it. She didn't scream, didn't cry, didn't make a scene. She left with the folder under her arm and the expression of someone who had miscalculated and knew it. She was immediately removed from her duties. The decision was documented, the amounts would be returned, and the company would not pursue the case publicly, but the removal was definitive and without right of return. That night, Nayara sat in the backyard of the house in Ribera until late, on a wooden bench she had bought at a second-hand fair, looking at the sky of Salvador that never got completely dark. The phone rang at 9:30. It was Rodrigo. "I wanted to know if you were okay," he said. "I am," she replied. "It was a lot for one day." It was. She sent the message to destabilize me. I know. And it almost worked. She said this without shame, because it was true, and lying about it would be a waste. Not because of what it said about you, but because it made me realize how much I had already built a trust I didn't plan to build. There was a pause on the other end. "Is that bad?" he asked with a voice that had lost the executive tone and sounded only like a question from someone who needed the answer. Nayara looked at the sky for a moment. "I'm still processing," she said. "All right," he replied. "I can wait." She stayed with the phone in her hand for a few more minutes after ending the call. Inside, the sound of Marcos's television arrived, muffled by the wall. The backyard smelled of damp earth, and someone, in the house next door, had cooked something with cilantro. Salvador at night was exactly like that, noisy and quiet at the same time, full of things happening in simultaneous layers that only made sense together. She thought of her grandmother, how Donna Generosa said that true love never arrives announced, never has a poster, never warns. It arrives like the smell of food. You only notice it when it's already inside the house. The inauguration of Confeitaria Generosa was scheduled for a Friday in November, when the heat of Salvador eased a bit at the end of the day, and the Bonfim neighborhood gained that particular weekend movement that arrived before the weekend. The name had been Nayara's choice, said almost by accident in a conversation with Rodrigo about the space's identity, and he had accepted on the spot without objection. It wasn't the name of a brand, it was the name of a woman, and that made everything different. In the days leading up to the opening, the mansion was in a state of urgent finalizations. Light fixtures hung, menu revised for the 5th time, stock organized, team trained. Nayara had recruited part of the team from the Bonfim community itself, prioritizing women who had some relationship with traditional Bahian confectionery, whether by training or family memory. The logic was the same as her grandmother's. The knowledge that is in the hands and memory of the simplest people is the knowledge most difficult to reproduce and easiest to ignore. She didn't want to ignore it. Rodrigo was present in almost all those final days, but in a role that had gradually shifted from the businessman who supervises to someone who was simply there. He carried boxes, climbed ladders, tried new recipes, asked about the history of each product on the menu. There was a quality of attention in him that was different from what Nayara had found in other people who had power. It wasn't the interest of someone who wants to understand to control, but the genuine interest of someone who is learning something they didn't know they needed to learn. One afternoon, 2 days before the inauguration, they were the last ones in the space as the team left. She was adjusting the arrangement of the cocada trays in the display case, and he was sitting at the table nearest the window with a coffee that had gone cold. The light came through the wide windows and caught the Portuguese tiles on the back wall, creating that blue and white vibration that Nayara had chosen specifically for reminding her of her grandmother's kitchen. "Why did you stop studying?" he asked. She didn't turn around immediately. "Life," she said simply. "You would have gone far." "I went far anyway," she replied, with a lightness that wasn't resignation. "Just by a different path." "You could go back," he said, "if you wanted to. There is a college here in Salvador with a business management program made for people who already have practical experience. I met the program coordinator at a conference. It's a serious program." She turned finally and looked at him. You researched this. He didn't look away. I did. There was an honesty in that admission that reached deeper than a compliment. He had thought of her outside the confectionery, outside the business, outside the context that united them contractually. He had thought about what she might want for herself, and he had done something concrete with that thought. "Thank you," she said. "No need to thank me, just telling you." The inauguration happened on a night that began with an open sky and ended with the breeze coming from the sea through the wide windows of the mansion. There were people from the neighborhood, people from the local press, representatives of cultural associations that Rodrigo had invited, company clients who came out of curiosity and stayed on their own. The space worked, not in the technical and cold sense of being operational, but in the organic sense of being alive. People entered, looked at the walls, tried the sweets, sat at the backyard tables and lowered their voices instinctively, as if they knew that was a place that asked for presence, not performance. Nayara circulated the whole time. She received each person with the same care, from the journalist to the neighbor from the house, from the city hall representative to the woman who had stopped on the sidewalk attracted by the smell and entered without knowing quite what she expected to find. There was something in the way she inhabited that space that communicated, without needing a speech, that the confectionery was hers in a way that went far beyond the signed contract. At one point in the night, Rodrigo went to her. They were both for a moment separated from the movement, leaning against the tile wall, looking at the full room. "Your grandmother would be very proud," he said. "She would be here," Nayara replied. "In this kitchen, testing every recipe and disagreeing with at least half of my choices. And the other half?" "The other half, she would say, was her idea." He laughed, a real laugh that reached through his whole body, not just his mouth. It was the second or third time Nayara saw that happen, and she noticed that each time it got a little easier to believe that man was whole behind the linen shirt. After the inauguration, when the last guest left and the team finished closing the space, Rodrigo asked to speak with her before leaving. They sat in the backyard chairs, with the garden light and the distant noise of the neighborhood around them. "I want to tell you something," he began, "and I want to say it clearly so that no ambiguity remains." She waited. "Since I stopped the car on that slope and bought your whole box, there was something I couldn't name. I told myself it was gratitude, that it was the project, that it was your grandmother's story, and it was all that. But it wasn't just that." Nayara kept looking at him without looking away. "I admire you," he continued, "in the way you admire someone who faces what needs to be faced without asking for applause for it. You asked me questions I needed to hear for a long time. You bring your family to the center of what you build instead of leaving them outside. You are the kind of person who makes the space around you better just by being in it." He paused. "And I know you are right to be cautious. You have every reason in the world. But I needed to say this directly, without wrapping." Nayara was silent for a moment. The backyard smelled of wood and coconut. Inside, one of the employees was still putting away trays. "Rodrigo," she said, "I also have something to say directly." He waited. "I am afraid of trusting and regretting it, of entering a story larger than I am used to inhabiting. But," she took a deep breath slowly, "I learned from my grandmother that fear and courage walk together. One does not cancel the other, and I am more courageous than fearful." He looked at her for a long second, with that expression she had begun to recognize. Not the expression of the businessman, but that of a man who was seeing something he didn't expect, and that was, against everything habit told him to expect, exactly what he needed. "So," he said carefully, "can we start slowly?" "Slowly I know how to do," she replied. And the backyard of Confeitaria Generosa was quiet for a moment, with the smell of coconut in the air and the night of Salvador outside, as if the whole world had woken up with the volume a little lower to let that moment exist without interruption. The months that followed the inauguration were proof that some things, when built on a real foundation, grow in a way that doesn't need haste to be solid. Confeitaria Generosa gained fame in a way that social media helped amplify, but which had its origin in something older and less editable, word of mouth. People who went for the first time returned. People who returned brought someone. There was something about the place. in the combination of the welcoming space, the true recipes, and the way each person was received, that created a rare kind of belonging. Nayara was recognized, not overnight, not with a spotlight, but gradually, with consistency, so that when someone said her name in public, it was to associate it with something she had built with her own hands. A profile in a local magazine called her the confectioner who turned memory into business. She didn't exactly like the phrase, but she understood what was behind it, and replied to the journalist with a precision that made it into the article. It wasn't memory that turned into business, it was business that learned to have memory. With Rodrigo, things developed with the caution she had asked for, and he had respected. There were no public declarations, no staging. There were lunches where they talked for hours without realizing time had passed. There were late-night messages about menu details that turned into conversations about each other's childhoods. There was a growing quality of mutual attention that was different from anything either of them had experienced, because it wasn't built on the need to impress, but on the habit of being honest. Marcos observed all this with a serenity that sometimes seemed to know more than the two of them combined. When Nayara arrived home after a day that had included Rodrigo in some significant way, there was a different lightness in her, and Marcos received her with the same serenity without keeping score, without commenting, without casting judgment. It was the kind of presence that left the other at ease to be exactly who they were, and that was the most generous gift Nayara knew. It was during a Saturday afternoon, when the three were together at the confectionery after hours, that Rodrigo made the first mention of the project that had been taking shape in silence. He had taken Marcos's folder of drawings on a previous visit, and with Marcos's permission had let a company architect study the plans. Not as an academic exercise, as a concrete proposal. What the architect had returned was a detailed analysis that confirmed what Fabio had sensed at the Bonfim mansion. There was in those drawings a design intelligence about accessibility that went far beyond common sense, a systemic vision of how spaces needed to be thought of to include instead of tolerate. "I want to make you a proposal," Rodrigo said to Marcos with the same directness he had used with Nayara in the first meeting. "I have a housing project in development, 4 residential blocks in the suburban railway area, with a proposal for full accessibility. The architect in charge is experienced, but he told me he needed someone who understood the subject not just technically, but from the inside, who knew what it means to live in a space that wasn't designed for you." He paused. "I want you to be a consultant for this project, paid with a contract with a voice in design decisions, not as a favor, as competence." Marcos was quiet for a time that seemed longer than it was. "I didn't finish the course," he said. "I know," Rodrigo replied. "But you have something that isn't in the diploma, and the project needs it." "Besides," Nayara said from where she was without raising her eyes from the tray she was adjusting, "you can resume the course now. The bills are organized. The time exists. You just didn't want to worry me by doing it while things were still difficult." Marcos turned his chair to look at her. She finally raised her eyes. "I've known everything since you printed the course program and left it inside the drawing notebook," she said. "You aren't as discreet as you think." He smiled. It was a smile that began small and grew until it took over his whole face. "So it seems you two have already decided for me," he said. "We haven't decided anything," Rodrigo replied. "We just put the pieces on the table. The decision is yours." Marcos sat looking at the two of them for a long moment. There was in his expression something Nayara recognized from childhood, that specific mixture of joy and surprise that appeared in the rare times when life delivered something the person had given up waiting for. "I accept," he said, and it was with that simple word that something was completed in the room in a way that none of the three could describe exactly, but that all three felt clearly. During that period, Nayara had also started conversations with the college Rodrigo had mentioned. The management program was at night, with entry for professionals with proven experience. She had gone through the interview, presented her history and the confectionery structure as a portfolio, and been accepted. Classes would start the following month. There was a gentle irony in it that she didn't fail to notice. The woman who had spent years selling sweets on the street under the October sun was, in the same year, entering an academic environment for the first time with the weight of a trajectory that no standard resume would know how to describe adequately. But that was also what made the moment significant, not despite the trajectory, but because of it. One afternoon, when the confectionery's movement had slowed and she was alone in the kitchen reviewing her grandmother's notebook, Rodrigo arrived without warning. This had become a habit between them that neither had formalized. He appeared when there was space, she received him when there was space, and the space had begun to exist with a frequency that was no accident. He sat on the other side of the counter and watched as she turned the pages of the notebook with the precision of someone who already knows each entry by heart. "Is there any recipe here that you've never made?" he asked. "There's one," she said. "Honey cake with spices." She wrote down the ingredients but didn't write down the proportions. She said proportion was something the hand knew. "Are you going to try?" "One day, when I feel the hand is ready." He sat looking at her for a moment. "You know," he said in a lower voice, "that I think of you when I'm not with you." She didn't raise her eyes from the notebook immediately. She let the sentence exist for a second before answering. "I know," she said, "because I do the same." When she finally raised her gaze, there was in his face that expression she had learned to recognize as the most honest version of him, without the weight of the position, without the armor of the successful businessman who had built a lot alone and learned to distrust what arrived without cost. It was the face of someone who had found something they didn't expect and who was still learning how to receive. "Slowly," she said, with a smile that was only hers. "Slowly," he agreed, and the grandmother's notebook stayed open between the two of them on the counter, with Donna Generosa's small handwriting recording on the page of the honey cake without proportions that some recipes only get ready when the person who makes them is ready too. The envelope arrived on a March morning, inside a craft paper with the discreet logo of an architecture firm that Nayara didn't recognize immediately. It was addressed to Marcos, but he had left early for the first in-person meeting with the housing project team, so she left it on the living room table without opening it. When Marcos arrived in the late afternoon, more excited than he had been in months, with stories about the lead architect, about the model they had presented, about a hallway detail he had suggested and the group had adopted without hesitation, he saw the envelope and was quiet for a second. "What is this?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied. "I didn't open it." He picked it up, examined the exterior, and opened it carefully. He read the document in silence. Nayara watched her brother's face as he read. The eyebrows that rose at the beginning, the expression that became more concentrated, the moment he stopped reading and sat looking at the page without turning it. "What is it?" she asked. He raised his eyes. There was something in his look she hadn't seen in a long time, that specific mixture of amazement and gratitude that appears when the world surprises in a way that logic couldn't predict. "It's a house project," he said, "with full floor plans, descriptive memorial and construction specifications." He paused. "Here in Salvador, in Bonfim, right next to the confectionery." Nayara stayed quiet. "Designed with full accessibility," he continued. "Ramp built into the design from the foundation. Hallways with standard width for free maneuvering. Bathrooms with adequate transfer space. Adjustable heights for counters and outlets." He stopped again. "Nayara, this plan was made by someone who understands what it means to need all of this." "Rodrigo," she said in a low voice. "Rodrigo," he confirmed. "There's a letter here with it." He handed it over. She opened it. His handwriting was direct without flourishes, with the same objectivity she had learned to recognize as part of who he was. Not coldness, but respect for what the other person was capable of understanding without needing ornamentation. The letter said that a few months ago, after the first visit to the Bonfim mansion, he had asked Fabio to develop a housing project as an exercise, not for any client, but as a personal study. He had given the guidelines: a house for 2 people, one of whom was a wheelchair user, in a neighborhood with street life close to a workspace that meant something. The instruction to Fabio was that accessibility should not be treated as an adaptation item, but as a design premise, that every detail of the space should start from the assumption that every body was welcome from the beginning, without concession and without excuse. The project had been ready for 2 months. Rodrigo had waited for the right moment to deliver it. In the letter he wrote that the land was bought, that construction could begin when and if they wanted, and that there was no expectation other than that that house should exist, because every family deserved a space that didn't just shelter them, but recognized them. At the end of the letter, in a line separate from the others, there was a sentence he had written by hand, different from the rest of the typed text. Donna Generosa taught that caring doesn't need an announcement. I am learning. Nayara folded the letter carefully and stood for a moment without speaking. Marcos said nothing. There was between them the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled because it is already full. She called Rodrigo while she was still standing in the living room. He answered quickly. "You bought a piece of land in Bonfim," she said. "I did," he replied, "without telling me. I wanted to be sure of the project before telling you. And if I said no?" "The land would stay," he said. "The project would wait. I have patience." She was silent for a moment. "Rodrigo," she said, "you made a house thinking of the two of us, of Marcos, of what he needs, of the details that most people never see." "I did," he said simply. "Why didn't you tell me you were doing this?" "Because it wasn't to impress," he replied. "It was to exist. If you wanted to accept, great. If you didn't want to, I still wanted it to exist, because it should exist." Nayara closed her eyes for a second. Outside, the Ribera neighborhood made its late afternoon noises, the bus passing, someone selling something on the sidewalk, a child shouting with joy in some nearby backyard. "I want to accept," she said. On the other end, there was a pause that lasted exactly the time of a deep, slow breath. "Then we start building," he said. Later, when she and Marcos had dinner together with the floor plan spread out on the table between the plates, he pointed to a detail in the main hallway sketch. "Look at this here," he said, with his finger on the project line. "The maneuvering radius is dimensioned for an electric chair, not just manual," he thought ahead. "He thinks like that," she said. "I know," Marcos replied. "That's why I like him." Nayara smiled at her brother with that intimacy of someone who shared so much, that words are sometimes just a habit, and real communication happens before them. "You knew before me," she said. "I always know before you," he replied, with all the quiet serenity of someone who is used to it. "You are very good at almost everything, Nayara, but at seeing yourself being loved, you are still learning." She didn't answer, because there was no answer that fit better than the silence that remained. 3 weeks later, on a sunny morning that came through the wide windows of Confitaria Generosa and caught the blue and white tiles on the back wall, Nayara opened her grandmother's notebook to the page of the honey cake, without proportions. She sat looking at the faded handwriting for a moment. Then she took a bowl, the listed ingredients, and began to measure by hand. There was no right measure written. There was only the recipe and the intuition of someone who was finally ready. The cake turned out good, and if you've made it this far with us, listening to every chapter of this story with your heart in your hand, then you know exactly what Nayara felt when she put the first spoonful in her mouth and realized that the recipe had waited for the right time to be made, just as the best stories wait for the right person to be heard. If this story touched something inside you, leave your like here. It costs nothing and means everything so that we can continue bringing stories like this. Subscribe to the channel because every week we return with a new narrative made for those who believe that real life has more emotion than any invented script. And comment below what you thought. What was the moment that most gripped you? Which character stayed with you after the audio stopped? We read everything, truly. Until the next story, we wait for you here. End of story.